some stories about some of the more famous people that you've known in numismatics.
Going back to Little Rock, to the first convention that I ever went to was at the Albert Pike Hotel, and it was the Arkansas Numismatic Society. And I had, in order to get into the city, we lived way out in the country, and in order to get into the city, I had to ride in with my dad. He was on his way to work. He worked for American also. But he went in at 6 o'clock in the morning, so I was at the hotel at 6 a.m. and the show didn't open until like 9. So I was down in the lobby waiting patiently, and I saw a gentleman reading a coin world. So struck up a conversation with him, and it was Mr. P.B. Trotter, who was a very noted collector from Memphis, Tennessee, and a banker. He Union Planters Bank. He was senior officer at Union Planters. And we struck up a lifelong friendship just from that encounter in the lobby of the hotel. The other people within the hobby, Grover Criswell, John Jay Pittman. There's a whole host of Grover and John Jay stories that everybody knows and could tell.
Tell a few of the best ones.
Well, I think one of the neatest ones was when A&A was in Atlanta, out at the Cobb Galleria. I'd been out to dinner with some friends, and we came in, and John Jay and his wife Gehring were seated down in the lobby area. And so we sat down with them and we started visiting. It was like 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. Well, John started retelling his experiences of going to the King Farouk sale in Egypt. And it was 1 o'clock in the morning before we realized that, we got to get up in the morning. We better get going here and wind it up. But, it was a moment in time that I had wished that I had had a tape recorder or someone such as yourself there doing videoing, because that was history that is lost now that John's gone. A Grover Criswell story was when the A&A was in Houston and Grover was president, and we were at the Astro World Hotel. Well, Grover had the presidential suite, which had been the home of Judge Roy Hoffhines, who was from Houston and was really what's the word I want to use? He was the father of the Astrodome, if you will. Well, it was a huge, opulent suite. I remember one of the bedrooms for the Hoffhines children was done in a jungle motif. The dining room in the suite would have seated 35 or 40 at the dining room table. And Grover was very gracious to invite a number of us up, and the whole experience of going into something like that was, and especially, back then, for me, that was just really awesome to see something like that. So the other people, we have so many luminaries in the A&A itself. Ed Rochette, Adna Wilde, there are two gentlemen who have given a lifetime to their love of the hobby and the love of the association. I remember taking a group of 120 to Aruba after the New York A&A back in '76, and Ed and his now deceased wife, Faye, were the escorts on the trip. And again, we had some real hobby stalwarts on that trip. We had Ray Byrne from Pittsburgh, and we had Jess Peters and his wife, Vi, and Jess was a foreign dealer from Decatur, Illinois. We had Larry and Vi Chavis, who were both very, very active collectors and real old-time collectors, if you will. So those are some of the people that I have fond memories of in the hobby.
Paul, what great stories. Come on, dig deep now. Think of a few more. I want to hear some more coins.
Well, I won't say that I knew them all, but there's just so many. I mean, over the years, I think one of the fun experiences that I had as a young person in the hobby was being appointed to the United States Assay Commission in 1973. I had applied in 1972, and my letter of recommendation came from George Bush, who at that point in time was the UN ambassador. And I didn't make it that year, but I continued to, or they asked, did we want to keep the request on file, and I said yes. And so I pretty much had forgotten about it. And at that time, I was flying for American in a position called Flight Service Director, and had flown down to Mexico and came back into Dallas Love Field. This was long before the DFW airport was open. And when I got off the airplane and got into customs, I was told that I needed to go call my boss in Chicago. Well, my first duty was to my customers, who I brought up from Mexico, and so I wanted to get them out of customs before I went to make that call. And 10 or 15 minutes passed, and then one of the managers came to me and said, your boss says you need to go call him now. And so I did, left because once you leave customs, you can't come back in. So when I got to him, it was like 6:30 in the evening, and he said, you need to call the White House. And I said, the White House? What White House? He says, the White House. So it's 7:30 at night, and but I tried the number. Well, it wasn't that there wasn't anybody home, but the number that I was supposed to reach, when I asked the operator for that extension, there was nobody there to be reached. Well, then it occurred to me that it had to have something to do with the Assay Commission. So I called home, and they'd actually called my home in Little Rock, and that was how they found the number to talk to my boss. But my mother told me, they said that if I didn't get back to them that day, that I wouldn't be able to participate, that I was being invited and I wouldn't be able to participate. Well, on an absolute pure lark, I contacted Eva Adams, because I had gotten to know Eva at that point and had a phone contact for her. And Eva suggested that I call Roy Cahoon, who was the public relations person for the United States Mint and for Mary Brooks. Didn't really know Mary very well at that point. So I called Roy. Eva gave me Roy's home, and Roy assured me that he would get a hold of the person the next day, because I would be flying the next day back to Mexico and would not be available to call them when the office was open. But he assured me that everything would be okay, and I, in fact, would be on that Assay Commission. So sure enough, by the time I got back to my apartment in Chicago, I had a telegram from Mary Brooks advising me that President Nixon had signed my appointment papers and that I would be attending the 1973 United States Assay Commission in Philadelphia. And some of the people that come to mind that were on that commission: Dorothy Baber from El Cajon, California; Gary Pittman, John Jay Pittman's wife, actually became our chief assayer for that event. Clifford Mishler was in our class. Val Pavlovsky was in our class. We had some really wonderful people that were a part of that. A fun story about our dinner after the commissioners had met. We were being taken to a private club in downtown Philadelphia. Well, it was pouring down rain. I mean, it was just a nasty, nasty evening. And we're on the bus. We get over to, I want to say it was the Union Club, but that may not be the name of it. And ladies were not allowed to go through the front door of the club. And Mary Brooks belonged to the club, but they had a specific entrance that they had to use to get into the club, and it was off of a back alley. Well, there were a number of ladies in our group. So the bus was attempting to get down this alley, and it wasn't going to happen. You know, the bus was just too large to fit. Well, with that, Mary Brooks looked at all of us and she says, "To hell with it." And off we went, and we all went through the front door, and there were 3 or 4 cigar-smoking gentlemen who were in the foyer area who were totally taken aback by the fact that women had come through the front door. And Mary said after the fact that she was never allowed to go back to the club again after she violated that rule. Now, whether or not that's a true story, I don't know, but that was her story, and she was sticking to it.
Did you know Walter Breen and John Ford?
Yes, I knew. I only knew Walter to speak to him. Certainly, over my career of working at the A&A Message Center, I paged him a time or two, and even after his death, there have been some attempts to have us page him to the Message Center as a joke. That's one of the ways we always know that the floor is getting very, very quiet, is when we get bogus pages to the Message Center. I'll tell you a John Ford thing in just a moment, but I have to tell a Message Center story. Greg Ruby, who is with the Baltimore Convention Center now, was one of our national volunteers working on the Message Center. And when he was in training, I forewarned him there will be times that people will, make bogus pages and try to put one over on you. So this particular day, I'm out on the floor and I hear him page Saul Kaplan. Now, Saul Kaplan was an old-time dealer from back in the, I would say, the 70s and 60s. And Saul had been dead for probably 20 years when Greg paged him. So I went to the Message Center and I said, "Greg, you just paged the dead person. You just were had." He said, "No." And I said, "Yes, you paged Saul Kaplan." He said, "Well, Ken Bressett's the one that asked me to page him." Well, Ken wasn't too far away. I actually was still waiting on Saul to come up. And I walked over and I says, "What are you having Greg page a dead person?" He says, "A dead person?" I said, "Yeah, you had him page Saul Kaplan." He said, "I didn't want Saul Kaplan, I meant Saul Taylor." So, at any rate, that's one of the funny things that's happened at the Message Center. John Ford's story, I knew John principally to page him to the Message Center over the years, and when I was the manager of American Airlines in Phoenix, one day I was going up to our Admirals Club, and as I came out of the concourse area, I almost physically ran into John, because he was headed out into the concourse with 2 very, very heavy bags, and I didn't know that he lived in the Phoenix area, and of course he was taken aback by what was I doing here. This wasn't there wasn't a coin show going on, wasn't an A&A going on, and so I said, "Well, where are you going?" He said, "Well, I'm going to New York. I'm on my way to see the stacks." And so I said, "Well, come on, let me help you." And he said, "Well," I said, "that bag's heavy," because he had 2 really heavy bags. I said, "Come on, let me help you." He said, "What are you doing here?" And I told him, I said, "I'm manager of American Airlines here." So I took John on out to the gate and got him set up, and then kind of said our goodbyes. But in the meantime, I went into my office and made arrangements to move him from coach into first class for the round trip And from that day forward, John and I exchanged skate keys, and we probably talked, I'd say once every 2 or 3 weeks. In fact, I did his travel after I left American, I did his travel for many years while he was still able to travel. And it was a real loss when John passed away a couple of years ago. I missed the opportunity of talking to him and hearing some fun stories. He was a real interesting guy.
About Q. David Bowers.
Q. David, I've known over the years. I really don't have any Q. David stories to tell, or to share about him. I would say this, that his term as A&A president, he did a marvelous job, and he also did a yeoman's work with the A&A anthology that he wrote. I've often wondered where in the world he found the time to do the things that he has done over the years, and because the books and things that he has authored are true numismatic treasures.
You've won an awful lot of awards over the years. What was it like winning the Medal of Merit?
Well, that was a real shocker. I went to that ceremony with Evie Kelly. I had been tasked by Ed Rochette to get Evie Kelly to that ceremony. And that was in Houston. And little did I know that it wasn't Evie Kelly that was going to get the Medal of Merit, that it in fact was me. So there was no one more shocked in the audience than I was to have been tapped for that award. The same is true with the Krause Publication Numismatic Ambassador Award. I was tasked to go to the Numismatic Ambassador's Breakfast with Evie Kelly. Evie worked the Message Center, and in fact, she's the one that got me to working the Message Center, and that's a different story, and I'll share that in a minute with you. But her husband was an avid golfer, and so he came to me and he says, she wants me to go to that ambassador's breakfast, and he says, I've got a golf game planned. He says, and if I tell her no, and she has to go by herself, there's going to be some fireworks. He said, would you mind going with her? Well, again, I was set up. Little did I know that they had planned to give me a Numismatic Ambassador's Award along with Clyde Hubbard from Cuernavaca, Mexico. So it was a real surprise to have received that when I did.
Did you know Clyde?
Oh yes, yeah. I got to know Clyde, again, initially by paging him for the Message Center, and then I guess it was it was during the term that Virginia Culver was president, the first woman president of the A&A. Virginia and Eva Adams had been invited to go to Mexico for the Mexican Numismatic Society's annual convention. So they asked me, would I escort them? And Eva traveled with an entourage. P.M. Williams, who had been her administrative aide, and Peg Greenway, who also was a very influential lobbyist on Capitol Hill, and Rose Bridges, I think it was Bridges, who also was a prominent person from the San Francisco area. Roy Cahoon and his wife, Anna Marie, were on the trip as well. And they were going at the request of Eva because Roy had been her PR person also. Well, as a part of this trip down there, Clyde hosted a barbecue at his home in Cuernavaca. And so we got up early one morning in Mexico City and headed down that way, and they had a lot of numismatic luminaries from Mexican numismatics were there. There were a lot of visitors from the United States who had also been included as invited guests. And so we went to Clyde's home, and it was just a marvelous, marvelous afternoon and evening's dinner. We also had lunch at a wonderful resort there called Las Mañanitas, and it still exists to this day. The very well-known Mexican numismatist Miguel Munoz and his wife Anita were there as well. So yes, I did get to know Clyde quite well.